Welcome back to The Truth About Local Government. And today I have the Chuck Norris of Best Value Intervention, the poster child for this initiative, Max Caller, who has kindly offered to come on and talk to us about navigating financial resilience, how to avoid Section 114. But before we dive into that, I want to start by saying, firstly, Max, thank you for coming on the podcast. How are you?
It's a pleasure. It's a very busy time for us in local government, but why are we surprised?
So, could you just give the listeners at home a bit of context as to your interaction with best value interventions and all the other good stuff that you've been involved with over the years?
Okay, so it's worth reminding ourselves that the Best Value Initiative was a Blair government first term initiative to replace compulsory competitive tendering. And I was involved as an advisor to the then Association of Metropolitan Authorities on compulsory competitive tendering. So I'd been through all the activity on that. And Blair, in opposition, set up a working group to look at what the alternatives were. And that ended up on the statute book as the best value legislation. I did not know at that time that I was going to be the chief executive of the very first authority to be subject to intervention, which was Hackney in 2001. Hackney was an authority which, when I went there, it was advertised as the worst job in local government, and that substantially undersold how bad things were when we got there. But on the other hand, the good news for the sector is it was possible to turn it round, and we did turn it round. And it was a pleasure to leave Hackney at the end of 2004 with it set on its way. And that's the real message. You can get in a mess, but you can get out of it. Since then, I have done inspections, statutory inspections at Northamptonshire and Liverpool, a non-statutory intervention at Nottingham City. I was a commissioner at the intervention into Tower Hamlets, the lead commissioner in Slough, and now I'm the lead commissioner in Birmingham. No one, no one at all should do that amount of best value interventions. It's not the way for a sane life.
A glutton for punishment. But just jokes aside for a second, I mean, it's an incredible achievement, and the sector owes yourself a huge gratitude in the work that you've done. But I want to go back to that when you talked there about you can get yourself in trouble, but you can get yourself out of this. And I want to start. That's quite a good starting point for this. Around what are the common weaknesses in governance that contribute to financial distress in local councils?
So it's interesting. Every failure is different, but actually, every failure is exactly the same. There are three key features in every single local authority failure which has led to intervention. And they are around issues relating to governance, issues relating to leadership, and honesty and communication. And the tragedy is that every failure doesn't just let down the people who live in the area of that council, it lets down the whole of local government and the whole of local democracy. Because we in the sector keep on saying to central government, you can trust us, we know what we're doing, we're really good at this, we solve more problems than you ever do. And every time we go and see central government and talk about these things, they point to the latest failure and say, no, we can't trust you, you get it wrong. But it is governance, leadership, and honesty and communication, because if you get those right, then you ask yourselves the questions and get the right answers that enable you to not arrive in intervention, not arrive in Section 114.
It's a really important point you've raised there as well, because actually at the moment, with devolution being again a massive topic with the new Labour administration, Labour government, it feels like a really an opportunity to seize the moment for local authorities across the UK for the sector. And you're right, it's kind of you don't want to waste this opportunity. What's interesting there is actually some of those elements are technical, but actually some of it is actually how would you describe honesty and integrity? It's just kind of, I don't know whether it's bravery. How would you describe it, Max?
Well, It is actually about being honest about risks, about what happens when things go wrong. If you can never admit that things go wrong, honestly, you can never learn from the mistakes you make. Not many people learn from success. You learn much more from failures. I'm an engineer originally by background. Engineers have learnt more from bridge collapses than they learnt from successful bridge design, because it's the collapse which says we can't go on like this. There must be something we don't know. What do we need to change? And if you compare the airline industry, where there's a virtue made of reporting on near misses and learning and making sure we don't do these things again, which helps keep the airline industry as safe as it is. We don't do that enough. We find it hard to say that went wrong. We find it hard to acknowledge that we have to learn from things. In fact, the worst press statement that you can ever make after a problem is, and we've all learnt the lessons, except we never tell anybody what those lessons are so that everyone else can learn from them as well. Because we don't acknowledge that we can and do make mistakes. And the
Why do you
point
think that
about
is,
local
Max?
government is
What?
it's an organization run by humans for humans. Humans make mistakes.
Sorry, I was going to interrupt there. What do you think causes this? Because I see it as well, and it's not because people are bad people, but what do you think causes that kind of inability to just kind of be open about errors?
So it's really difficult. Some people feel that acknowledging an error means that this is a political or a managerial failure, which is career limiting. Some of it is about the culture. If you have a culture which doesn't allow some level of dissent, some level of challenge, that anyone who says, do you know what, boss, I don't think this is going to work, and that's seen as a career limiting opportunity, then you won't get people to put their hands up and say, I understand where you're trying to get to, but we can't get there from here. You have to go in a different route. And I think that's often a problem, that the group think that we can't tolerate dissent, that there are no alternatives. There are always alternatives, or that we don't appreciate risk, that risk is not seen as a dynamic thing which you manage every day, every second of a project. But no, we evaluate risk, we write it down, and that's the end of it. In fact, rarely have you ever seen a committee report or a cabinet report which has a recommended course of action and then says, but by the way, there are these risks, and if they materialize, they can't be mitigated, and this is what's going to happen. Because not every risk can be mitigated. Some will come true.
So if we break that down then, because there's two key points you just talked through there. You've talked about risk management and you've talked about culture in terms of creating culture. And there's St. Helens did a really, Kathy there, the chief executive, when she came in, she created a whole new culture of open and transparent. If you make a mistake, that's fine, but let's learn from it. So if we take culture first, what advice would you give to chief executives about how they create a culture of where people can put their hand up if they've made a mistake and learn from it? How do you achieve that as a leader?
Well, first of all, you have to establish values which you and everybody else live by. There are too many places that I've seen on inspection where the values are on the wall, but it's not how we do things around here. And actually living the values, and that means members as well as officers. In many places I've been to, there are values, but they only apply to officers. You can't do that. That disconnect isn't right. So you have to establish the right values where it's safe to express some level of challenge. And once that challenge has been dealt with, then you can move on together. But if you're never allowed to challenge, if you're never allowed to say, we can find a better way of doing this, or Are you sure this is going to achieve the goal that you're trying to get to? If it's such a strong lead from the top that no dissent is permitted, you will never ever get out of trouble.
Incredibly insightful. So the next point then is around risk management. How do not just leaders, not just officers, but how does everybody best manage risk within the sector?
First of all, you have to acknowledge that there is risk, and you have to have a realistic appraisal of what risks you can mitigate and what risks you can't. And thinking about what happens if you can't mitigate a risk and it materializes is part of something that is not seen everywhere. I think that's a really important point. The second point is that risk changes through the lifetime of a project. What you think of the risks as the start is not the same as it is through the middle and towards the end. So you have to keep thinking about risk as a dynamic activity, and it's something for everyone every day, which is less about writing it all down, although I have seen plenty of places where the corporate risk register just doesn't address the big things that really matter because they're not allowed to be spoken about. And it goes back to this honesty in communication. You've got to be able to acknowledge that there are risks, even if they're managerially or politically inconvenient.
It's a really interesting point there about risk being an organic creature, something that we have to continuously look at. Because I think one of the key things that we see when I see about risk management in the sector is that people see it as a tick box exercise. We've
Mhm.
considered risk. Okay, that's done. As opposed to it being almost a part of that cultural value of we embrace risk in terms of not, because actually if you have somebody that maybe is a little bit more risk averse, but as long as they're aware of the risk, as long as they're actually thinking about it regularly and it's a constant conversation. But again, I guess that comes back to your previous point, Max, about culture, creating a culture where you have to discuss risk and it has to be featured in a really important way. The bit I want to come on to now is obviously at the moment, financially, it's never been harder for local authority leaders to run services. You know, how do you have risk assessments used to prevent financial distress?
So you need to think much longer term. The authorities that get into the most trouble don't do their medium term financial strategy as the main driver of the next 3 years budget. It's a forecast, but it doesn't change the way you look at things. It's still the budget is still an annual process. But most of the big changes that we need to make in local government have probably an investment need and certainly a 2 to 3 year timescale. So you take decisions today knowing that they won't impact the budget until year 3. That's actually quite hard in local government. It's quite hard in politics generally to actually go for the longer term deal, stick with your investment, understand what your goals are, and only reap the rewards later on. If you're in an annual election system, it's even more difficult. It's very difficult to take long term decisions when you're electing by thirds. But even in a 4 year system, it means that administrations coming in year 1 of their 4 year term, they have got to have done most of the hard work. And if you're a new administration arriving, you won't have had the chance to even do that thinking. You won't get to grips with what's actually going on in your authority until it's almost too late to solve those problems. So that's one of the pressures. That's one of the real things that we struggle with in thinking ahead to get the budget set for a number of years in front of you rather than doing it as an annual activity.
Again, what advice would you give to people then who are in that situation? I mean, I appreciate there's not a silver bullet for this, but what advice would you give to them?
That you've actually got to be brave enough to say, This is what I've got to do this year, but that's not going to solve my problem. What is the shape of my organization 3 and 4 years out? That the challenge that commissioners have set Birmingham is to recognise that the council will be around 15% smaller in 2 years' time. So, what does that council look like? And it's not the great visionary plan which has, green things and all sorts of lovely activity on the front cover. It's really, what's our purpose? It goes back to a real hard-nosed appreciation of what's the essential things we have to do. And if we do those, what are we not going to do? And if we're not going to do them, can they still be done by others? And thinking about how you do place leadership rather than place delivery. It's a very different way of doing business. And it's not something that some authorities find easy to do because it's hard, because you have to take people with you, because it takes a long time before you see the results. So you have to be quite clear. And then the management of risk, of course, is absolutely crucial, because you start down this process. What happens if it goes wrong? You've invested all this time and effort and you haven't got a plan for an outcome. So
It's yeah. I guess
it's
there's
hard.
an element of bravery, isn't there? It's looking ahead,
Yeah.
and my for last question, Matt. Just 'cause I'm conscious I don't want to run out of time on this. Is what changes would you like to see taking place within the sector? I mean, I appreciate you've had visibility across a spectrum of local authorities in different stages of their kind of evolutionary cycle. What would you like to see change in the sector to benefit the sector?
So the first thing that I would say, which many others have said, is that you really need to have much greater security from central government funding. You need to have a rolling 3 year funding stream. People have talked about it, but actually delivery has been always in the promise rather than in the actuality. But that enables a greater fixity for local government to be able to plan, because you're making changes which run too far into the future, and you can't do that if the winds will blow you off course. The second thing I think needs to be done, and this will be a surprise to many people, I think that there needs to be some sort of certification and qualification for the three statutory officers. Being the best accountant in the world does not make you a Section 151 officer. You don't need to be a lawyer to be a monitoring officer, but even if you were the best lawyer in the world, that is not what the job of monitoring officer is. And there is absolutely no qualification at all for what makes a great chief executive. And yet those three statutory officers, crucially, do set the culture, do set the governance, are the people who, when they fail, give rise to many of the failures, because they've got to be brave. They've got to stand up and say and hold the line with respect to good performance and good practice. And yet you can arrive in any of those positions, and nothing that you will have done in the past will qualify you for the role that you are now going to take on.
It's a really, really interesting suggestion, and I guess I'm going to run out of time here to really get into that with you. But I love that. And Max, firstly, just thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. Thank you also for the work that you've done across the sector. It's people like yourself that make the improvement plan that one as a sector possible. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Good to speak to you.
Today, thank you so much, Max. Today we've had Max Caller on, who is obviously one of the thought leaders around best value intervention, and I hope that there are some tangible things that you can take away from this and implement into your council and really benefit from it. But again, thank you for listening and have a great day.